They sat on their golden thrones, spinning webs of deceit, thinking they had pulled a blindfold over your eyes. Their voices dripped with honey, but their hands reeked of filth. They played the game of manipulation, painting themselves as saints while sharpening the knives behind their backs. Oh, they thought they were untouchable, wrapped in the armor of their own lies. But what happens when the shadows start whispering the truth? When the walls they built to cage, you crumble beneath the weight of their own fraud? You watched, you listened, and then you struck. One crack in their porcelain mask, and their entire illusion shattered. The truth did not crawl, it erupted, roaring like a wildfire, consuming their carefully constructed kingdom of deceit. The moment your voice echoed through the silence, their fake smiles twitched, their eyes darted like rats caught in the open. They had spent years crafting a narrative, dressing themselves in the robes of the righteous. But the moment you exposed them, they stood naked in the storm, vulnerable, pathetic, desperate. And oh, the crocodile tears came flowing, sobs so theatrical, so masterfully rehearsed, yet dripping with the same venom they once spat at you. They cried, they wailed, they pleaded for mercy, but you saw through it all. They weren't sorry, they were just terrified of the consequences. Panic set in. They tried to rewrite the script, to twist reality back into their favor. But the ink had dried, and the truth was already burned into the minds of those who once believed in them. The same lips that once sang their praises now whispered doubts, then suspicions, then outright disgust. Their world, once a fortress of deception, had become a house of glass, and you stood outside, holding the first stone. Oh, how quickly their arrogance dissolved into fear, how the mighty stumbled, how the false idols fell. They were choking now, gasping for air, drowning in the ocean of their own lies. And you watched with a knowing smile, because this was not revenge. No, this was justice, delivered by the hands of the very truth they feared. Their voices cracked under the weight of their own confessions, their words faltering as they scrambled for any shred of control. But there was no control left to seize. You had ripped it from their grasp with nothing but raw, unfiltered truth. Their eyes darted, their hands trembled, like cornered prey who suddenly realized they were never the hunters. The walls were closing in. The darkness they once sent you into was now swallowing them whole. They were at your mercy now, and oh, how delicious their terror was. Every whispered conversation, every forged document, every manipulation they once orchestrated was now a dagger against their own throats. The people who once followed them with blind loyalty now watched them with disgust, waiting to see the execution of their fraudulent empire. And what did they do? They turned on each other, like rabid dogs trapped in a cage of their own making. They clawed, they blamed, they screeched accusations into the void, but it was too late. No one was listening, no one cared. They had spent their lives weaving a tapestry of deception, and now it was unraveling thread by thread. And the best part? You didn't even have to lift a finger. You simply exposed them, and the truth did the rest. Their faces contorted with desperate attempts to salvage what little was left. But their eyes, oh, their eyes, betrayed them. Hollow, defeated. A quiet realization creeping in. They were drowning, and no one was reaching out to save them. The very people they deceived had now become their executioners, their whispers turning to shouts, their shouts turning to demands. And as their world crumbled, they did what all cowards do. They wept. not for the pain they caused, not for the lives they destroyed, but for themselves, for their own pathetic downfall. Their crocodile tears flowed like rivers, but the world had already turned cold. No one bought the act anymore. No one was fooled. But you? Oh, you stood there watching, savoring the moment, because you knew this was only the beginning. And as you stood amidst the ruins of their once untouchable empire, you felt it. Power. Not the kind they craved, not the kind they stole, but the kind that comes from knowing the truth is an unchained beast. And you had set it free. You weren't just a spectator. You were the storm that left them exposed, the force that tore through their kingdom of deceit. They whispered your name in hushed voices, afraid to speak it too loud, as if the mere mention of it would summon their doom. And maybe it would. The truth had a taste, and it was bitter on their tongues. They tried to spit it out, to replace it with more lies, but the world was done listening. The same voices that once echoed their falsehoods now demanded answers, and no explanation could save them. Their masks were gone, their disguises torn away, leaving behind nothing but shivering husks of what once passed as powerful men. And oh, how they despised you for it, how they hated you for exposing them. But hatred was powerless against the force of reality. They couldn't undo what had been done. They couldn't erase what had been seen. And the more they struggled, the deeper they sank. So they did the only thing left to do. They ran. Some tried to hide behind new masks, slipping into the shadows, hoping to rebuild their deception elsewhere. Others clung to whatever power they had left, grasping at fragments, bargaining with ghosts. But none of them could escape the fate they had sealed with their own hands. Because the thing about truth is, it never forgets, it never forgives, and it never stops hunting those who thought they could outrun it. And you were done watching, done waiting. It was time to see how much further they could fall, because this story wasn't over. No, this was only the first act. The air was thick with the scent of their desperation. Their voices, once so smug, so confident, had turned brittle, cracking under the weight of the nightmare you had unleashed upon them. They thought they had controlled the narrative, thought they could spin their way out of anything. But reality had become a beast with fangs, and it had turned on them. Every lie they had ever whispered, every illusion they had ever crafted, had come back to devour them whole. And now, their kingdom of deceit lay in ruins, the ashes of their falsehoods clinging to their trembling skin. You watched them scramble, their hands clawing at empty air, searching for something, anything to hold on to. But there was nothing left. No more masks to hide behind. No more illusions to shield them. The world they had so carefully manipulated had turned against them, their once loyal followers now circling like vultures, eager to feast on the carcass of their deception. They had spent their lives sculpting an empire of lies, and now that empire was collapsing, stone by stone, brick by brick. And the best part? They knew it. They could feel it in their bones, in the pit of their stomachs, in the hollow ache of their dying pride. They tried to fight back, of course. That's what the desperate always do. They spat out denials, their words laced with fear, their voices shaking with a panic they couldn't quite suppress. They reached for their old tricks, their well-rehearsed performances, hoping, praying, that they could still manipulate the masses. But the spell was broken. The world had seen them for what they truly were, and there was no unseeing it. The more they spoke, the more their words betrayed them. The more they struggled, the deeper they sank. And you stood there, silent, watching, knowing that this was a punishment far worse than any you could have inflicted yourself. This was justice, served cold, merciless, inevitable. And oh, how they begged. Not with words, not at first. No, their eyes did the pleading for them. Eyes that had once burned with arrogance now shimmered with the dull, lifeless glow of impending doom. They had wielded power like a weapon, used it to crush anyone who dared to defy them. But power was a fickle thing, a double-edged blade, and now it had turned in their hands, slicing through their carefully constructed facade. They had spent years ensuring their survival at the cost of others. But now the roles had reversed. Now they were the ones on the chopping block, and there was no one left to save them. Their crocodile tears flowed, but they had lost their effect. The world had grown tired of their theatrics, their false remorse, their desperate attempts to reclaim the illusion of innocence. No one believed them anymore. No one pitied them. They had orchestrated their own downfall, and now they were being forced to choke on the very poison they had spent years feeding others. It was a sight to behold, watching them unravel, watching them crumble beneath the weight of their own sins. They had built their empire on manipulation, on deceit, on carefully constructed illusions, and now every foundation had rotted away beneath them. There was no escape, no salvation, only reckoning. They turned on each other, just as you knew they would. Loyalty meant nothing to people like them. It never had. Their alliances were built on convenience, not trust. And when the fire started to burn too hot, they were more than willing to throw one another into the flames. They whispered accusations, pointed fingers, tried to shift the blame onto anyone but themselves. It was pathetic, really. Watching them rip each other apart, watching their bonds dissolve into nothing more than desperate self-preservation. They'd spent years pretending to be untouchable, but now they were reduced to scavengers, scrambling to survive in a world that no longer feared them. And you didn't have to say a word. You didn't have to lift a finger. The truth had done all the work for you. You had merely shined a light on their darkness, and that was enough to send them spiraling into the abyss. They had written their own tragedy, authored their own destruction, and now they were being forced to live in the ruins of the lies they had built. They tried to escape it, tried to outrun the consequences, but truth has a way of following you. It seeps into the cracks, seeps into your very skin, until you can no longer deny it. They had spent so long running from it, but now it had caught up to them, and there was nowhere left to hide. The silence that followed was deafening. Their voices had been silenced, their screams had faded into nothingness, and all that remained was the wreckage, the remnants of a kingdom that had never truly existed, the shattered remains of their once unshakable power. And amidst it all, you stood untouched, unbroken, victorious, not because you sought vengeance, not because you desired their suffering, but because you had done what they never expected. You had revealed the truth, and you had let it speak for itself. And in the end, that was enough. That was everything. And yet, even as they crumbled, even as they begged and pleaded and cursed the sky, you knew this was far from over. This was only the beginning of their fall. They were ghosts now, wandering, lost, stripped of the power they once wielded like a weapon. Shadows of their former selves, stumbling through the ruins of their deception, whispering desperate prayers to a world that no longer listened. The faces that once looked upon them with admiration now held nothing but disdain. They had been unmasked, exposed for the frauds they always were, and there was no coming back from that. The weight of their own lies had crushed them, left them gasping for breath in a reality they could no longer manipulate. And you? You stood above it all, watching them rot in the mess they had created. They used to walk with their heads held high, their chests puffed out, convinced they were invincible. But now they slithered through the dirt, their backs hunched, their eyes darting like cornered animals. They had spent their lives constructing a fortress built from falsehoods, and when the foundation cracked, they had nowhere left to stand. They tried to rebuild, clawing at the scraps of their former influence, but it was like grasping at smoke, intangible, slipping through their fingers no matter how desperately they reached. They were drowning in their own disgrace, each lie they had ever spoken tightening around their throats like a noose. Some of them still fought against it, still clung to the belief that they could reclaim what they had lost. They spewed empty justifications, wove new lies to cover the old ones, but no one listened. No one cared. The stage they once ruled was empty, the spotlight extinguished. They were nothing now. Whispers of scandal, cautionary tales muttered in hushed tones. The higher they had climbed, the further they had fallen, and the world had watched their descent with cold, unforgiving eyes. This wasn't just a loss. This was obliteration. But the worst part? The thing that sent them spiraling into madness? It wasn't the ridicule. It wasn't the disgust. It was the silence. The world had moved on. The people they had deceived, the ones they had controlled, had turned away, uninterested in their pathetic attempts at redemption. They had screamed for attention their whole lives, demanded to be seen, to be heard, to be obeyed. And now, they were invisible. Their names, once spoken with reverence or fear, had become meaningless echoes of a past no one cared to remember. Irrelevance, an agony worse than any punishment they could have imagined. And yet, some still refused to accept it. They tried to forge new identities, to slither into different roles, hoping the world's memory was as short as their own. But their stench lingered. Their corruption stained every word they spoke, every step they took. No matter where they ran, the truth followed. No matter what masks they wore, their sins seeped through the cracks. They had spent their lives branding others as disposable, stepping on anyone who threatened their control. But now, they were the ones discarded. They were remnants of a past no one wanted to revisit, fossils of a corrupt dynasty that had crumbled under its own weight. They sat in dimly lit rooms, staring into the abyss, haunted by the ghosts of their own misdeeds. No more applause, no more adoration, just the deafening silence of irrelevance pressing down on them like a suffocating fog. And in that silence, the echoes of their crimes played on repeat in their minds. Every betrayal, every deception, every innocent life they had trampled on in their blind pursuit of control. There was no erasing it, no running from it. The walls they had built to keep the truth out had caved in, trapping them in the wreckage. The few that still dared to speak, to plead their innocence, found their voices drowned out by the roaring tide of truth. They screamed into the void, but the void did not answer. No matter how desperately they tried to reshape the story, the ending had already been written. They were the villains, the deceivers, the ones who thought they could rewrite reality itself, only to be crushed beneath the weight of their own arrogance. And the world had no sympathy for them. You didn't have to lift a finger. That was the beauty of it. The very thing they had feared most, their own exposure, was the weapon that destroyed them. They had laughed at the idea of consequences, sneered at the notion of accountability, but they weren't laughing now. Now, they were running, hiding, wasting away in the shadows, terrified of a world that had stripped them of the illusions they once thrived upon. The same lies they had used to control others had become the chains around their own necks, and the chains were tightening. They had always believed they were the architects of fate, the masters of manipulation. But fate has a cruel sense of irony, because now, as they sat alone in the ruins of their broken world, they finally understood what it meant to be powerless. They finally knew the feeling of being discarded, of being voiceless, of screaming into a void that did not care. The empire they had once ruled had turned to dust, and their names would be nothing more than footnotes in a story that no one wanted to remember. You had no need for revenge. Revenge was for those who still carried anger. But you were past that. You had given them exactly what they feared most. You had taken away their power. You had reduced them to nothing, and nothing is what they would remain. The truth had buried them alive, left them to decay in the graves they had dug for others. There would be no resurrection, no return, just an endless fall into the abyss they had spent their entire lives trying to escape. And as you walked away from the wreckage, leaving them to rot in the emptiness they had earned, you realized the most beautiful part of it all. They had done this to themselves.